Many of us today came in here carrying something we'd probably rather not bear. A situation we can't escape. A diagnosis we'd rather not own. A problem that defies solutions, even though we're expert problem solvers. A grief that seems to have grown instead of quietly receding. All of these are situations that make us feel helpless. And I don't know about you, but that's not a feeling I particularly enjoy. I actually tend to structure my life in a way to avoid feeling that. And when it does overwhelm me, as it did earlier this week, my response is to get angry. And if you haven't seen that, you would not like me when I'm angry. But beneath that anger, for me at least, is feeling like I have no power to deal with the circumstances I find myself facing. And then I'm struck by an irony conveyed by a question from a newsletter that I get. The question is, how are you complicit in creating the conditions you say you don't want? The irony, of course, is that when we feel most helpless is when we feel the least in control of the conditions we face. So I'm not suggesting we all self-sabotage and are responsible for our uncomfortable situations, poor health, relational fractures, unresolved grief, or failed life plans. But I wonder how we might experience those things differently if we actually embraced being helpless instead of fighting it at every turn. This irony, I think, is at the heart of the passage Jared just read. Now, to help us navigate that, I want to borrow a framework from one of my favorite movies. Hopefully it doesn't lighten the mood too much, but the movie is Inception, and it is maybe one of my favorite movies, and hopefully it won't be too confusing the way I use it here. I would love to explain it in more detail and to get into all the plot twists, but for our purposes here, let's just say that the overview is it's a team of specialists that are able to enter into dreams to either extract information or to plant information, which they call inception. And what makes the film memorable, or for many, utterly confusing, is its structure. The characters don't just enter one dream, they go deeper to a dream within a dream within a dream, each level having its own architecture and different rules of engagement. They have to go deeper in order to help the protagonist of the film, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, to finally find the rest and return he's been looking for, yet also actively avoiding. Now, rather than dreams within dreams, I want to suggest there's layers within layers in John's passion narrative. There's what's happening on the surface. And then there's another layer, and then there's another layer below that. And we need to get to that lower layer to extract an idea that just might change everything. Inception is ultimately a heist story. John's passion narrative is the opposite of that. Now, for context, this past week, we've been spending time in the passion narratives, those sections of the Gospels that recount the events leading up to Jesus' death. On Monday and Tuesday, we were in Mark chapter 14 and 15. On Wednesday, we were in Luke chapter 22. Last night, we read John 13 and the institution of the Last Supper. And then today, we are in John 18 and the crucifixion narrative. Today's passage tells much of the same story we heard earlier in the week. But John is writing his gospel much later than the other authors were. Has more time to reflect, and his story has a little more depth to it as he reflects theologically on the significance of Jesus' death. Now, when we think about stories like this one, we have to remember that whether movies or gospel stories, the plot is driven by the verbs. The setting, the descriptions, the characters, those are all important. But it's what the characters do, what is done to them, what it costs. That's what drives the plot forward. John's narrative is no different. And I'm going to say at each layer of the story, there's a key verb that captures what's going on. These three verbs are crucify, release, and deliver over. Each one is significant in this passage, and each one has an irony to it. Each one will hopefully function as a road marker along the way so we can keep track of where we are in the story. So if we start on the surface, this is what anyone standing in Jerusalem that Friday would have seen. John tells us simply that Pilate delivered Jesus over to be crucified. Crucified. We've probably heard that word so many times that it's lost its weight. Or perhaps because we don't have a true modern equivalent, we never really grasped what it meant to people in John's day. Crucifixion was not simply an execution. Rome had other ways to kill people that were faster and more efficient. In her book, aptly titled The Crucifixion, Fleming Rutledge, comparing crucifixion to our modern form of execution, at least here in America, she says, electrocutions are at least theoretically supposed to be humane and quick. But crucifixion as a method of execution was designed to intensify and prolong agony. Further, she says, it was specifically designed to be the ultimate insult to personal dignity, the last word in humiliating and dehumanizing treatment. Degradation was the whole point. But it gets worse. Because of the nature of the method, nailing a live person to a piece of wood and then placing that across a heavy, upright wooden post, the crucified person actually becomes their own executioner. The weight of their own body makes breathing harder and harder until personal suffocation finishes what the Romans started. Crucifixion was chosen to be maximally public, maximally slow, maximally humiliating. It was the height of cruel and unusual punishment with its own ironic twist. A person dies utterly alone as their own body becomes the instrument of death in front of a watching, jeering public. Crucifixion was so terrible that a new word was needed to capture it. And we still carry that word in our language. The word excruciating, which we use for unbearable physical or emotional pain. The Romans didn't just invent a method of execution. They helped invent the word for the worst thing a human can feel. So here we are on the surface of the story with a man condemned by a Roman governor who can find no fault in him, watching him be delivered over to die, the death Rome reserved for insurgents and slaves. John wants us to feel the weight of that before he shows us anything else. He doesn't push past the details, but he doesn't linger in them either. He slows down. The soldiers weave a crown of thorns. They dress him in a purple robe. They mock him. They strike him. Pilate brings him out before the crowd and says, "Here's the man." What does the crowd shout? Crucify. And they do so knowing full well what it entails. When we're confronted with things like this, even in moments right now, we are tempted to look away. We want to find a release before the pressure becomes unbearable, which is exactly what Pilate tries to do. So if we go down below the surface, we find a different dynamic emerging. Looking more closely at the interaction between Pilate and Jesus, we find another key verb and another key irony. On the surface, this looks like a straightforward power transaction. Rome has the power, Jesus has none. Pilate holds the authority of the empire in his hands. Jesus stands before him bound. And yet, watch what John, or listen, or remember what John does with Pilate. From the moment Jesus is before him, Pilate can't find his footing. He's literally moving back and forth from the crowds inside to the crowds inside. Pilate is unsettled, yet is supposedly the one in charge of the situation. He tries everything he can think of to release Jesus, which is the key verb here, release. He offers the crowd a choice. Since it's Passover, he'll release one prisoner. Surely they want this man and not Barabbas the insurrectionist to be free, but they choose Barabbas. Not what Pilate was expecting. So he has Jesus flogged, perhaps thinking that roughing Jesus up will suffice for the crowd, when in reality, he can just decide to release Jesus if he wants to. Pilate is trying to find a way out of the situation. He says 3 times he can find no guilt in Jesus. He wants the release, but not for Jesus' sake, for his own. He wants to put enough distance between himself and this situation so that it stops pressing in on him. And while not necessarily excruciating for Pilate, he seems to be feeling a type of helplessness that's all too familiar. He's doing exactly what we do. He's an expert problem solver, but he's run out of solutions. He's tried every way out, and none of them have worked. So he calls for a basin of water. He washes his hands in front of the crowd, signifying that Jesus' blood is not on his hands, though that hardly absolves him of the responsibility. It's a ritual meant to transfer the blame to someone else, and yet, ironically, it's his name that lives on in the creed that we recite every Sunday. But I think John wants us to see something else in this exchange. While Pilate scrambles for an exit that doesn't exist, Jesus stands still. Pilate's authority visibly crumbles under the pressure of the crowd. Jesus speaks with a quiet that's almost unnerving. When Pilate says, don't you know I have the power to release you or to crucify you? Jesus answers, you would have no power over me at all unless it were given to you from above. The man in chains is telling the man holding the keys where his authority actually comes from. Jesus is in complete control. Pilate can't decide what to do. So here, the story stops just being about 2 men in a room in Jerusalem. It starts being about something that's happening in every room where human beings are trying to manage what they can't control. We're all Pilate, more than we would like to admit. We find ourselves in situations we didn't choose and can't resolve. And we exhaust ourselves looking for the release that will make the excruciating feelings stop. No one likes to be that uncomfortable and feel that helpless. So we seek out things that will bring comfort and control. We structure our lives carefully so we never have to face the thing we most fear. And none of it ultimately works. In Inception, the movie, the characters perform the climactic heist in a dream within a dream within a dream. In John's story, I think the climactic gift is in this next layer, the layer, below the surface. Now, we didn't have to get into the original languages of the New Testament for the previous 2 verbs. For this one, we do just a little bit. Crucify is pretty straightforward, whether it's in English or Greek. There's not a lot of nuance or range of meaning. And release can mean a few different things, but it mostly just is what we think of when we think of release or letting go. But the third verb is different. In Greek, it's paradidomai. You're probably not going to remember that, but I'm going to say it anyways, paradidomai. It has a range of meaning that's not captured by a single English word. It gets translated various ways, even within the story we've been reading. And I think John deliberately uses it to create a redemptive, ironic reversal. So last night in John 13, John used the verb to capture what Judas is up to. We also would have seen it earlier in chapter 18 if we had started our reading at the beginning of the chapter. Judas delivers over Jesus to the religious leaders. Because this handing over has a deceitful edge to it, we prefer the word betrayal. So everywhere you see Judas betrays Jesus, it's this word, handing over. The second time it appears, it shifts just a little. The chief priests and the officials deliver Jesus over to Pilate. It's not quite the same nuance of betrayal that we had with Judas. It's the kind of deliverance that happens when powerful people decide that one man's suffering is a reasonable price for their own security. Caiaphas, the high priest, had already said it plainly. It's better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. So they deliver him over. They pass him off to the Romans, hoping the Romans will do what's best. The third time, Pilate delivers Jesus over to be crucified. Having exhausted every exit, having washed his hands, having declared innocence 3 times, he delivers him over anyways. Less for expediency, maybe more out of cowardice. But this kind of handing over is to avoid what's right because what feels safe is more attractive. So by the time we reach the cross, Jesus has been handed over by everyone who had any power to do otherwise. But there's a fourth time that John uses that word. When Jesus had received the sour wine, John tells us he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and he delivered over his spirit. The same word. But now Jesus is not the object. He's the subject. He's not the one being handed over. He's the one doing the handing. In the moment of his death, he doesn't have his life taken from him. He gives it. He does what he said he would do, and he lays it down freely. I think this is what John has been building toward. The man who told Pilate that no one takes my life from me, make good on that claim. The chain of betrayals and cowardice and expediency that brought him to this point can't explain what's happening here. At the deepest level, it's not a story about what was done to Jesus. It's a story about what Jesus did for us and for our salvation. He was delivered over to everything we most fear, to helplessness, humiliation, abandonment, the excruciating weight of circumstances outside of his control. He went all the way to the bottom, and he did it freely. Which brings us to what this story is really about. Not just what Jesus did, but what it means for us. We often hear that Jesus died in our place, that he took the penalty we deserved. And that's true. But John is showing us something that goes alongside and deepens that. Jesus didn't just die instead of us. Jesus died ahead of us. He's not the only one who absorbed the penalty, paid it in full. He's the one who went first into the very condition we most desperately want to escape, and transformed it from the inside out. In this way, Jesus is not just our substitute, but he's our representative. He stands in for us, not only to pay what we owe, but to open a path we couldn't open. He descended to the depths of human suffering, so the depths would no longer be a dead end. Which means the things we've been spending our lives trying to avoid, the helplessness, the being delivered over to circumstances we can't manage, the excruciating feeling of having no exit, it's no longer the end of the story. It's the path through it. I asked earlier how we might be complicit in creating the conditions we say we don't want. Here's one answer. We spend enormous energy avoiding the very feeling that would drive us to the one place where relief actually exists. We want to be released. But what is being offered is something different. Not release from the depths, but a guide through it. Not an exit from the excruciating pain, but a presence in it. One who has been to the bottom, knows the way back to the surface. And by embracing our helplessness rather than avoiding it, we're met with the grace that we really need to navigate the circumstances we didn't choose. When we're truly ready to hand over our own helplessness, we will find there's a power that we hadn't thought possible. Amen.